you all for coming. Even if some of you might not be as interested in insects, I'm hoping by the end of this talk we're going to get some kind of passion going, because I'm very, very, very passionate about insects. So today I'm going to be having a talk on tiny worlds, big impact. So some of the contents of what we'll be talking about today, we'll answer the big question of why insects. We'll talk about some of the importance of finding balance in biodiversity, the famed insect apocalypse that we're currently in, but we'll lighten that up with some success stories as well. And then we'll talk about insects and sustainability, so that can kind of tie into things. And my course, thank you for coming, guys. Local context, so that'll be sort of Skerries specific, some nature-based solutions, the zoo in your backyard, what you can do to help, and finally we'll end things with a bit of a Q&A session and discussion, so we can hopefully get some talks going about insects. By the way, this will be supplemented with some photography that I've been doing sort of around the place. I'm really into macro photography, so I just thought it'd be a nice chance to kind of see some insect imagery. So this is a golden tortoiseshell beetle I saw, not in Ireland, they're in the US, but there's a lot of interesting native species I'll be showing throughout this presentation. So, why insects? Well, as you can see from this little pie chart here, insects make up an insane amount of the overall animal species diversity on planet Earth. In fact, insects comprise over 75% of all animal species on Earth. So they're a big deal, and people tend to focus a lot on, you know, say saving the polar bears is very important, yes, but insects comprise such a huge number, and mammals, sadly, we only comprise about 0.06% of all species on Earth. And I know that might make you feel a little bit stressed to be part of the mammal family, but you can turn that frown upside down, because insects and the environment, they play a huge role that benefits us all the while. So one of these big ones that I'm sure everyone is aware of, pollination. So pollination of our native plants, in fact, 75% of all crops in agriculture depend on pollination in order to be grown. So, of course, that's a huge deal. This isn't just from your typical apiary honeybees and all this as well. There are a lot of insects that are really integral pollinators for our environment, and some of them might not have as much focus. Say solitary bees, which are bees that don't live in large colonies. They typically live in small holes. They actually play a huge role in pollination, and they're actually much better at pollinating than your typical honeybees. And that's kind of what we have to be worried about. When we think of sort of the Save the Bee movement and everything, it's great to have that progress growing, but if you're just focusing on honeybees or just one specific species, they might outcompete our native variants. There's also a lot of other important pollinators that you might not expect. Flies, beetles, so there's flower beetles, moths, which typically pollinate at nighttime, and even some insects like mosquitoes are actually pollinators as well. So just to know that a lot of insects are playing important roles there. They're also primary agents of decomposition and nutrient cycling. So when you go outside and say you have your compost bin, of course you know that's being broken down and dissolved mostly by insects. You have wood lice, well, cockroaches, termites. These might not be the prettiest of insects, but they're extremely important in keeping our environment chugging along and breaking down matter. Same goes for soil aeration, very important to allow plants to take root. So you have your garden worms, which are digging burrows. You have ants, which are a personal favorite of mine, creating vast colonies and providing sort of aeration. Water filtration is not one that a lot of people tend to think about, but insects play a very important role in water filtration. Some examples of this might be caddisflies, which, if you haven't heard of, they start their lives as larvae in the water, and what they do is they collect little pebbles and bits from around them, and they actually use these to form a cocoon to live inside. And it's very cool, but aside from that, it's actually very important in filtering the water and just ensuring that it's clean, and they're great indicators of very clean water. And also, side fact, about caddisflies, the glue that they use to actually stick to themselves, it's being tested at the moment for use as an underwater adhesive. So there's a lot of also practical benefits to these insects. Also food for amphibians, mammals, birds, etc. So even if you're not a huge fan of insects, the animals that you like are a fan of them some way down the line. So you'll have your birds in your garden, amphibians like frogs, mammals like hedgehogs, everything. And finally, natural pest control. So you might think having more insects could be an issue at some points, but they're very good at balancing their own populations. So you'll have all these extensive, vast food webs that start to sort of control each other as long as sort of left to their own devices, which brings us to finding balance in biodiversity. So, because insects are so speciose, many of them actually rely on each other and these intricate relationships in order to keep their populations under control. So the importance of biodiversity for insect preservation. I'm not sure how many of you have seen the BBC series Wild Isles with David Attenborough. It's absolutely wonderful. I was watching it the other day, and they showed this amazing partnership between, well, it's more of a parasitic situation, but it's with a large blue butterfly found in the UK and its relationship to these myrmica ants. So what the butterflies do is they lay their eggs and their larvae hatch, they start eating plants, fall down, and then suddenly they start to release this smell, and they want to smell like an ant, essentially. And so they trick these worker ants into picking them up and taking them to their own colony. And then inside there, the butterflies, as larvae, they look nothing like an ant, but the ant thinks it smells like an ant, it sounds like an ant, it's an ant. And essentially, the larvae will then be taken care of by these ants, they won't be predated, and to return the thanks, they'll eat all the ants' babies, and then the butterfly will leave, and it looks so beautiful, so delicate, but it's actually quite a violent little strategy. But these butterflies are very important pollinators for a lot of our native species in meadows, and they were, I believe, extinct for a short while in the UK. We can't find them here, but they were recently reintroduced, and because they rely on this very intricate relationship that depends entirely on this different species, they nearly were wiped out entirely. So we really do depend on biodiversity. Many pollinators may be species specific, so this can be towards another insect, as we've seen here, or even to the plants that they pollinate. So you might see your bees visiting, every which plant, but some plants only want certain insects to visit them. So if you look at a tomato plant, not just any insect is going to be able to pollinate that. They are actually activated by what's called buzz pollination. So you have your tomato flower, and they need something like a bumblebee to come up to them. And what bumblebee does is, once it lands on the flower, it starts buzzing at a certain frequency, and then the tomato plant goes, oh, yo, it's a bee. And then they pop open, and they shoot their pollen out. And so the bumblebee can collect that. And the flower wants the bumblebee to visit them, as opposed to different insects, because they know they're very good pollinators. And because of their extensive hairs and everything, they're going to be very effective at spreading their pollen to other tomatoes. So these intricate relationships mean that we do need not just one species of insect to pollinate everything or to keep things in check. Some species require other species in an intricate relationship in order to work. And this goes towards parasitic, commensal, and symbiotic relationships. And anyone who studied biology might be familiar with these terms, but so parasitic would be sort of parasites like ticks, and one animal benefits and the other one doesn't. So like a tick, you have it on you, the tick is getting, juicy blood, you're not really getting much out of that. So that's that relationship. Then you have a commensal relationship, so that can be where one benefits and the other isn't really bothered. So a dung beetle would be a good example. They roll away animal poop, and the animal might be a bit happy that that's gone, but it's not too much of a benefit. And a symbiotic relationship where both animals would benefit. So an example of this might be ants and aphids. So I don't know if you know green fly, but the ants will almost herd them like cows. So they bring these aphids to plants that look healthy. The aphids will suck out the juice from inside the plant, and then in return they'll secrete this sugary solution called honeydew, and the ants will actually drink it up like sort of like milk, and they have this symbiotic relationship, so they both benefit. And finally, for balancing plant and invertebrate populations. So through having this biodiversity, no one insect is going to be completely overriding the rest of the food chain and completely taking over. Because you have all these intricate systems, the populations balance themselves. So just as an example, here's some photos I took of species that you can actually find around in Ireland. So we have on site here 2 parasitic wasps called ichneumon wasps, and we have a cabbage white butterfly caterpillar, and I think a dagger moth caterpillar. Anyway, so you have caterpillars and wasps, and they have this interesting relationship. It's a parasitic one where the wasps will, it's not a very pretty sight, but they'll lay their eggs inside the caterpillar. And then after a few weeks, the little wasps will burst out of the caterpillar and turn into adult wasps and fly out. It's like something out of Alien. It's not very pretty. People don't want to think about it too much, but it's extremely important in balancing these populations. In fact, 50% of caterpillar predation is actually as a direct result of these parasitic wasps. And you might think it's mostly birds and other species, but these wasps play an integral role. And usually, they have very specific species that they actually predate on. So ichneumon wasps, which is what this family is called, it's actually one of the most diverse families of insects in the world. There's about 25,000 currently discovered. I think there's far more. Just in the UK alone, we have 2,500 species. And each one of these typically has a very specific set of insects that it likes to predate upon and lay its eggs in. So because of that, if you have a specific caterpillar problem, you have a specific wasp to take care of that specific problem. And if we don't allow for those links in biodiversity, you might lose some of these wasp species, which might not seem like a big deal, but that means the rest of these caterpillar species are able to just breed as much as they like, cause as much havoc as they like. These particular guys have a penchant for cabbages. Your cabbages are gone. It's a disaster. So it's very important to kind of keep those chains in check. So just here's your handy dandy little food chain web, and essentially without all these intricate connections, it's not going to work like that. It's going to be busto. So this leads me to the insect apocalypse. It sounds very drastic, and it kind of is, but there are still things we can do. But a study in Germany recently found a 76% decrease in flying insect species from 1986 to 2016. That is a very concerning number. And I always use the example of, say, when you're driving in the countryside. I'm sure anyone here who used to drive like a few decades ago maybe, you're driving in the countryside and suddenly your windscreen is just splattered with insects all over it. Nowadays, if you do that, you're not really going to see as much of a splatter zone, which is good in a way, but it's actually not that good in many other ways. So global insect biomass, so this is essentially the weight of all insects, that has decreased at a rate of over 2.5% per year, and that could lead up to 98% in 100 years. So just to put that into perspective, 2.5% is about 12 million tons of insect, and that is equal to basically the total weight of all wild mammals on Earth is about 6 million. So each year we're losing about 2 times the weight of all wild mammals on the entire planet, which is very frightening number. And of the around 1 million species of insect that are currently discovered, 40% are thought to be in decline, and 1/3 are thought to already be endangered. So that is, and as we showed previously, 75% of all species on Earth are insects. So it's frankly a staggering number. It's actually predicted that there are almost about 4.5 million insect species that are still to be discovered. So we've only really scratched the surface, and if this damage is being done to the species we can already see, imagine the damage that could be being done to species that we don't even know are out there yet. So, what are some of the big contributors? Overuse of pesticides is a huge one. We have taken some strides to improve that in recent years, but it has been, the damage has essentially already been done for a lot of insect populations. In 1962, there was a book written by a wildlife scientist called Rachel Carson called The Silent Spring. I'd heavily suggest giving it a short read, but it basically showed the damage that a certain pesticide called DDT did to populations of, it essentially affected the entire animal food chain. But it did things like weaken the eggshells for eagles, and so their babies would just not make it. But it had, of course, huge overarching impacts for insect species as well. So they're currently taking strides to improve that, but there are huge issues with the use of pesticides at the moment. It's actually thought that only 1% of the pesticides applied to land actually apply to the plants that they're being used to defend. So there's just a lot of that. Habitat destruction is a major one as well. With insects, habitat destruction can take almost any form. Say if you're trying to protect the orangutan, you have to prevent certain amounts of rainforest from being cut down. But for insects, any little space is a habitat. If you have a tuft of grass in a corner, that's a habitat. So it's very easy for, on an interpersonal scale, habitat destruction to occur. On the bright side, that means regrowth and improvement is made much easier as well. But yeah, it just can be an issue. If you're just installing a new parking area and laying down asphalt, that's a lot of insect decline in that region. Invasive species is another huge one. So in Ireland, we have seen a lot of new invasives coming in. An example I can think of for an invertebrate would be the New Zealand flatworm. So they've come in, they've outcompeted our native worms, which is, it's really sad thing to see. And again, those worms are extremely important in balancing soils and improving fertility from the ground up. So they're really important at the bottom of the food chain. Pollutants, that's another huge problem, kind of ties in with the overuse of pesticides. And a lot of that could be overuse of fertilizers, which gets sent into the soil, and then from a lot of rain, which we have here in Ireland, it'll flow down into local water bodies like rivers and streams, and you can have too many nutrients in the soil and in the water, and that could cause what's called eutrophication, where a lot of algae kind of grows on the top, and it sucks out all the oxygen from inside the water, which kills a lot of the species inside. But there's all sorts of pollutants. If you have heavy metal pollution, plastic pollution as well, it's just not going to be good news for any ecosystem. And climate change as well does have a considerable impact on insect populations. It can have an impact on the way certain species behave. So we've actually seen increases in locust swarms, that kind of thing going on, because as temperatures increase, there could be increased scarcity in food, and so the insects will be looking to travel around, find food elsewhere, disrupts the whole chain, and yeah, it's not good news for anyone. But after that little depressing episode, we can go to some success stories. So over here to the left, we have an image from the Sustainable Skerries and Skerries Community Gardens Carter Bee project with Charlie and Marion there. They did amazing work to establish a population of large Carter bee in Skerries. So they're sort of a rare species, and they got help from the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and it is a phenomenal success what has been accomplished here in Skerries. Again, the All Ireland Pollinator Plan does all sorts of works. They do wildflower projects. They do work directly with schools and local communities, education. They provide monitoring groups where people can monitor the populations of different species, and it's just great work all around. urban green spaces, those initiatives. There was recently a study done in Melbourne where they increased a lot of the greenery in cityscapes, and they found that it actually increased the number of insects living there by over 7-fold, which is a huge improvement. So even in the heart of the cities, you can have a huge impact on your insect populations. And I know that is Australia, and they tend to have a lot more insects, but even in Ireland, we can have a huge impact. And finally, integrated pest management strategies. So this is to sort of combat some of that agricultural damage that's being done. IPM is essentially a form of taking care of the land with taking into account the effect it could have on insects. So in Europe, we're taking a lot of new strides. Actually, in 2014, it was mandated that every farmer has to follow integrated pest management. In the US and other parts of the world, there is a lot of catching up to be done. But we've shortlisted the number of pesticides that are allowed to be used because we don't know the effects they might have on the environment. So I believe there are 70 pesticides that have been banned in the EU that are still being used in the US. Like, not here, so we're good comparatively. So there are some steps being taken and some biological pest control measures. So instead of using just dumping chemicals onto your land to fend off insects, you have more natural means being used. You have actually a really interesting technique called biorationals, where they get the parasitic wasps and other species that we were discussing earlier, like mites, and they pour them onto the plants. So the wasps will actually target the specific species that you don't want being around. And eventually the wasps will run out of food once they've killed all of the problem insects in your area. And it's a totally natural means of taking care of the problem, and it's not going to impact the nature around you. So, moving on to insects and sustainability. So insects actually have a profound effect on the future of sustainability and just the environment, environmental science in general. So on the left here, we see a wax worm, a silk moth larva, and they're actually being studied at the moment on the effects they can have at digesting plastic. So these specific ones that are being bred at the moment are able to fully digest certain variants of plastic and turn it into organic matter. So that'll have a huge impact on the future of science, for sustainable science, especially for packaging solutions and everything, because as we know, plastic typically takes, at some occasions, 1,500 years to fully decompose. And then on the right here, we have some mealworms eating styrofoam. I don't think they're even special mealworms. Mealworms in general will just tank most things. But if you give them styrofoam, they can actually digest it as if they were just eating it as a staple food, and they turn it right back into an organic material. So that's brilliant. And now for something that might make some people uncomfortable, but the future of food. Now, some of my course mates are here, and they'll know that I did in first year a project on incorporating insects into my diet in order to sort of have a more sustainable protein source. Some people on the Irish Independent.ie, it was posted on their Facebook. They were really mean to me in the comments, but I'm sticking by it. So there are so many benefits to eating insects, and I believe that in the future more people might catch on to it. So let's discuss some of that. Why eat insects? So here, by the way, are the crickets I used to breed for eating, and I made a little mealworm pizza situation. It was really good. But 80% of the world's nations already consume insects as food. So if you take a trip around, there are a lot of communities that are already eating insects, and there are many reasons to do so. Crickets, up here, they contain more than 3 times the protein, 4 times the iron, and 6 times the calcium as beef. So they're already having a greater impact just on the scale of being used as a viable food. They require 60 times less land to produce the same amount of cricket as protein, as beef. They consume 100 times less carbon and feed than beef production. So red meat production in general is a bit of a Zippo when it comes to sustainability. Crickets and mealworms, I mean, it's just so efficient, and it actually tastes quite good. We'll get into that. And it also consumes 200 times less water than beef production. So essentially at every possible scale. Now, in an ideal world, the most sustainable thing to do is to go, vegan. But if some people are wanting a slow transition, or if you just want like a simple source of high protein and quite sustainable food, insects are the way to go. But we're going to play a little mini game. We'll start. It's called Audacious or Crustaceous. I have a little theory going on, and I think the ick factor for eating insects has kind of been overhyped, because we already eat these things, lobsters and crabs and all the rest of it, and I think people don't realize just how similar they can be. So, over here, we have a crayfish on a stick. Very popularly eaten all around the world, crayfish, some people love it. And then, onto the right here, we have a scorpion on a stick. I don't see too much of a difference there, actually. And I'm not a huge seafoodie, so I honestly might see an improvement on taste for me there. That's just me. Over here, we have sand crabs, also known as mole crabs. Very popularly eaten around the world. In Florida, they're actually a really popular meal. So we have a cooked one on the right here, just on a stick. And to the right here, we have some roasted cicadas. I mean, are we putting two and two? Like, I'm just saying. Here we have a bowl of fried soft shell crabs. Okay, looking very spindly, fried all up. Here is a bowl of fried cockroaches. Okay, I'm just kidding. Those were fried onions, but my point still stands. It still stands. Okay, no one would have known. So, moving on. What gives Skerries several legs up on the competition? I was getting real groovy with the graphics at this point. I love that. But I just wanted to make it sort of a localized example, and also because I have a lot of pride for the work that's been done in Skerries recently to boost the knowledge of biodiversity in general. So, to start, momentum. We've started to establish a lot of new projects and works lately. This includes the Skerries Community Gardens, the Stream Huggers team, Coast Watchers. We have a whole shebang going on, and there's a lot of projects that have been undertaken in order to improve our relationship to biodiversity in Skerries. Then major inroads have already been established. So again, we already have a lot of these groups set up, and because of that, it's quite easy to start taking action from here in order to make improvements to not just biodiversity for insects, but we have coastal biodiversity, marine, if any works for sustainability in general, all go towards making an impact here. General interest in sustainability. I mean, I'm very happy that everyone's here, actually. This is a wonderful turnout. There's more people than I was expecting, and I think this really comes to show that we as a community have taken a huge interest in sustainability, especially as of late, especially with all the work's being undertaken. And I think it's a great opportunity to grab that momentum and that interest and just go with it and get more projects going forward. And finally, we have a wide array of ecosystems just within the locality of Skerries. So you might think of us just as a coastal town, but we actually have marine environments, we have marshy areas, we have some forested areas, we go by our Gillen. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the different environments that we already have here. South Strand. So this is a coastal habitat, and we have a lot of marine dunes lining up, which have been under a bit of damage in some locations because people keep walking on them, but it provides an excellent habitat for all sorts of species. This can include pollinators, such as red admiral butterfly. So there's all sorts of coastal flowers that grow in this area, especially if they're sheltered by the marram grasses. And also the grasses themselves provide an excellent habitat for a wide variety of snail species. So marram dunes, I don't know if you've heard, a lot of areas, especially in the country, have protected zones where people can't be building seawalls and all this because there's always some kind of special snail. It always comes down to a special snail somewhere. And I think it's brilliant. But it provides an excellent habitat for so many species. The ballast pit, which is one of my personal favorites, is kind of close by my house and the train station. It's an unlikely haven for biodiversity. Most of this biodiversity is centralized along these hills and banks. Some insects that you might see up along these hills here are those solitary bees we were talking about earlier. They like to dig their burrows along the soils of the cliffs. And in the second ballast pit as well, which is sort of the skimmier one next to it, you can find a lot of different species as well. You can see yellow meadow ants along these areas where the grass is allowed to grow a bit more wild. What they like to do is they get aphids called soil aphids, and these are small insects that feed on the roots of the grass stems, and they'll sort of pop them over there, and then they almost live entirely underground, a subterranean species, and they'll just drink the honeydew from them and just live peacefully as long as you have them in an area where the grass is kind of allowed to grow out. And also grasshoppers. It's one of the few places in Skerries where you'll see a lot of grasshoppers, especially along these hills up here. So I love popping down, doing a bit of photography, and yeah, honestly, it's just a brilliant spot. Skerries Mills. So thanks to the work of the Skerries Community Gardens team, we have a large carder bee population here. We also have so many pollinators that have visited. You have a stream passing through as well, so you can get some of those aquatic insects such as caddisflies and all sorts. So yeah, here are just some pictures of these I took during a walk through during the Skerries Eco Festival, which we'll be dropping next year as well, just to pop it out there. And yeah, just a brilliant habitat. And finally, Ardgillan. This is probably the largest wooded area near Skerries, and that is mostly centralized in the forested regions of Ardgillan, but also you have a lot of species popping up in the carefully maintained gardens, which are currently being used to promote a lot of native species as well. So there's a lot of things you can find in Ardgillan. I just popped up a couple here that I've taken photos of. So this is a wood-boring weevil. It's kind of a beetle species that pokes a little hole into wood that's like dying or decaying, and they sort of hollow it out. So they're very important at breaking down tough organic matter like fallen trees, and they help to promote new growth. This is a magpie moth, which I spotted in Ardgillan. They have beautiful coloration. There's a lot of different moth species that you can spot in the area, and it's also home to some beautiful fungi. This is a little turkey tail mushroom that I spotted in there. But because you have all of this wooded area, you're able to get a lot of fungi species, and therefore a lot of insects that you might not otherwise find in other areas because they specialize on feeding on this. But all these locations also serve as important biodiversity corridors. So, because you have all of these areas that are rich in insect biodiversity, having them as a way of connecting different habitats together is extremely important. So, here's just an example. I mean, we don't have something like this in Ireland, but they help to sort of connect habitats together. This can have profound impacts on, say, the genetic diversity of an area. So you don't want to have all of your species hanging out in one pool and just kind of doing their own thing. You want them to interact with different habitats. And the way to do that is by having these bridges where they can sort of cross over and introduce new species to an area. There can also be species migration, which is very important. So say in the US, you have your monarch butterflies, and they love to sort of travel all the way to New Mexico to hibernate. And what people like to do is set up these milkweed plants, which the monarchs use to feed from on the way. And it's important to have these biodiversity bridges where they can make a lot of pit stops on their way. And also natural scenery. They look absolutely beautiful. We have one established outside the ballast pit, actually, which is sort of a wildflower patch that leads up. And it's very helpful in getting pollinators to sort of move to new locations. This is just one of my favorite biodiversity corridors. It's on Christmas Island. Once a year, they have this big crab migration where just millions of crabs are just shifting through the whole island. And of course, now that it's more of a populated zone, you do have a lot of roads and a lot of, very sad crab incidents. But they've started implementing these new crab bridges, which I think is absolutely brilliant, where the crabs can just hop up. I don't know how they know that they're not going onto the highway, but they just hop onto these bridges and they cross through, and I think it's a wonderful little thing they've established. So, what does all this work in the local community and establishing these corridors do for us at an interpersonal level? Well, that is the zoo in your backyard. So, this actually has impacts for everyone. If you just look outside, if you help to establish these biodiversity corridors and promote biodiversity in certain areas, you will see an impact occurring right next to your home. I'm just going to go through some species that I think deserve an extra little highlight. So here are some flower beetles that I've spotted. I spotted most of these in the ballast pit, but you can spot them anywhere. And I think they're just brilliant. They're also closely related. There's a species that I've been trying to find for a very long time, called the thick-thighed beetle, and they essentially look like these, but they got these like huge gams. I think they're absolutely fascinating. I really want to find them, but they're tricky. And they're very important pollinators too. As you can see from this image up here, you'll see a lot of pollen grains stuck to the small hairs at the top of the beetle. So again, a pollinator that not everyone might think of when they think of the word pollinator, but they're everywhere. Flies, I think, are very slept on. I will defend flies to my last breath. They have such diversity, and they're never usually talked about, but you have a huge variety of species, and they also have these intricate courtship displays for a lot of them. So you see these two doing their little embrace there, and this species here actually does a little hypnotic dance with its wings, where it just kind of shifts around in front of a mate and tries to attract them. And there's a lot of these interesting behaviors within flies that people don't tend to notice because, I mean, if you hear a fly buzzing near you, the typical response is to get the newspaper. But flies are absolutely wonderful. And they also serve as important pollinators, and they can help decompose things like, I mean, doggy doo on the side of the street. Flies are very important at breaking down everything. And there's also a lot of biodiversity within flies, such as these bee mimicking flies. So these are hoverflies, two different species, and essentially what they're trying to do is mimic more dangerous species like wasps or bees, and have other insects be sort of afraid of them and not want to predate upon them. So there's a lot of these interesting little relationships and a lot of interesting species of flies, and I think there's just a lot to go into there. But speaking of mimicking wasps and whatnot, just wanted to highlight one of my favorite species that you can find here. That is the ruby-tailed cuckoo wasp. So I just want to highlight it. It's absolutely beautiful. They are another parasitic wasp, so their life cycle is actually a bit gnarly. They do be laying eggs into the nests of other solitary bees, and they're hoping that their larvae will sort of eat through the hosts and then pop out. But they're an absolutely beautiful species if you ever see them. And I just found this one in my garden, so it's clearly the work Sustainable Skerries has been put in. And here are just a compilation of species that I found just within my garden. And honestly, if you just take a look outside, you can find an entire just cavalcade of species that are going around. So we have woodlice snails, stink bugs, weevils, butterflies, moths, bees, a lot of spiders, and I mean, it's incredible. And I've gotten really into it ever since I started doing macro photography, but you can just do it on your phone. Honestly, these days, phones have been getting better and better at taking snapshots, and yeah, promoting an interest in biodiversity, especially if you have like children at home at a young age, it's so great to get into, and that's how you get your little bug catching boyos going forth. So thank you, Mom, for promoting this interest when I was younger. But yeah, no, it's brilliant. And that takes me to friends of the garden. So there are also a lot of species that you can find nearby that are great for your own garden. You might think of insects as sort of a pest, but there's a lot that help out. So some of that could be natural pest control. That can be spiders, or ladybugs are another great one. Decomposers. So here I just have a picture of a soil millipede, but they help to break down your soil, produce compost, and yeah, just absolutely brilliant. Fertile soils as well, so that'll be your worms and all your critters that help to break down decomposing material. And they help invite native animals. So I just have ladybug there, but if you have a lot of insects in your garden, you're also going to have a lot of songbirds. You're also going to have a lot of amphibians, maybe some hedgehogs, little visitors like that. So there's a lot that can be done there. And finally, I just wanted to dive into some of the things you can do to make an impact. So working like the environmental field, I often get people asking what impact they can personally make to change things. And say if you're thinking about stopping climate change, things like that, it can seem quite overwhelming. And there are, of course, things you can do. But when it comes to insects, again, these habitats are very centralized. There's a lot that you personally can do and you can see the direct benefits of. So getting involved with your local community is amazing. I would heavily suggest supporting the work of projects such as like Sustainable Skerries. We have a lot going on. So you can take part in biodiversity monitoring. You can just help out with local projects. There's a lot you can do. Setting up green spaces as well is brilliant. If you have a garden, that's a great place to start. You can do all sorts. You can set up insect hotels, which just provide a habitat for all sorts of species. You could set up a pond nearby. I went to a great talk on making a wildlife pond in your own back garden, just with like a bucket. Sarah was there, and it was absolutely brilliant. And that can help promote species such as like hoverflies and dragonflies, a lot of native species. And just learning more about your local species in general is a great help. If you get the iNaturalist app, it's my personal favorite for trying to identify different insect species. All you have to do is take a snapshot of an insect on your phone and then pull it up, and it'll tell you all the suggestions of what species it thinks it is. And then you can learn a lot about each individual species, and sort of promoting that knowledge and sharing that with other people gets people attuned with their native environments and the animals there, and that really just helps promote change in this in general. Supporting local community projects, I gotta really stress this, it makes a huge, huge impact. So Skerries Orchards team recently planted a lot of fruit trees around, and not only will that be great for insect pollinators, but it's just a great thing to do and to feel that sort of community spirit. So I'd really suggest supporting community projects, because protecting our native insects, it starts at this community level, and at the level of each household, it's so important. And finally, advocating for nature-based solutions. So these would be solutions for issues like, say, pest management, requesting for changes in policy if people are just dumping so many different pesticides, instead using those more naturalistic methods, such as using your parasites like native wasps and stuff like that, and also for things like cover crops for farming. So in the winter time, not just leaving the soils bare, planting down crops, and that's preventing all the nutrients from draining out. There's just a lot of nature-based solutions that you can help implement in your local community. So yeah, that's most of what I wanted to talk about, I believe. Oh, also plant native. If you're planting anything in your garden, please plant native. You can get wildflower seed bombs online, and I think some of the best ways to promote wildflowers in your garden is to not actually even invest in all that. It's to just let things grow out a bit. And they suggest the best way to promote pollinators in your back garden, if you have grass, cut it maybe in the summertime every 6 weeks or so, just let it nice and long. There's no issue. We're not in Australia. A snake is not going to jump out. It's going to be fine, and it's actually going to be beautiful. If you let it grow out, go through a couple changes, you'll start seeing new flowers sprouting up, new species that you've never seen before. It's just absolutely beautiful to have things a bit wild. But yeah, that's most of what I wanted to talk about today, except, hi Mom, happy Mother's Day. There are a lot of great insect mothers as well in this world. I just want to highlight them. This earwig takes care of its babies for weeks after they're born, and then they let go. So that's how I feel about you. It's brilliant. Absolutely. Oh, and while I'm here, it's been my granddad's birthday recently, so if everyone could wish him a happy birthday, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for watching. Now, are there any questions? I want to dive into a quick Q&A session, or sort of a space where we can compile ideas and how we can improve maybe Skerries. Yeah, me?
Do you ever feed your parents and insects?
I have tried. I have really tried. I used to, actually today I wanted to get, cricket flour, yes. It's something I used during the challenge I was doing previously, but they basically just grind and mill up crickets into a flour, and you can actually make baked goods with it and everything. But they've introduced new laws in the UK and Ireland, which makes it harder to get. That's not a sign that it's bad. It's just a sign that people don't know what's going on. Yes?
Is there any way that you can make like insect hotel in your garden? Because I have like hundreds of wildlife in my garden.
Oh, and you want to make an insect hotel for them to live in. That's brilliant. So you can actually get a lot of resources in local shops and stuff. If you just get hollow sticks and you like to pile them up, or even toilet paper cones, if you get those and you put in a lot of hollow sticks inside, and actually I believe we have some pamphlets up here on local gardening techniques. I believe it's on Insect Hotel Ideas somewhere in there, but even just having a pile of twigs somewhere, it makes a habitat for insects. So there's a lot of ways to promote insects, especially woodlice. They'd love it if there's just a bit of clutter around. So even if you have a lot of leaves that you want to pile down, that's a great way to promote insects. Any other questions?
Where can people see your photographs?
Oh, yes. Let me shamelessly plug that real quick. So down here we have a little tag. It's @friendly.neighborhood.bug on Instagram. It's where I have all my photography if anyone's interested in seeing more of that. Especially now that sort of the spring is kicking in and summer, I'm going to try to be taking a lot of nice shots, and especially around Skerries, so I can sort of promote that. Yes, Colin?